Do we think that there were any catastrophic impacts between 13,000 years ago and now?
We do.
Like closer to us?
We do. And
when was that?
That was for our group. There plenty of people who speculate on this stuff and published, but our group published a paper in 2021 that came up. That was the one they were knocking there, giving grief, where we investigated, and I went over there as the first person from the Comet Research Group to the site. I got a call from another British catastrophist, Tweedy gentleman, Phil Clapham, and Clapham said, "George, I'm in touch with a biblical archaeology group in the Jordan Valley who believe they found Sodom." And I said, "Is this out of a damn movie?"
What is a biblical archaeology group?
That means that there are people of faith that are following archaeological practices and operating as archaeologists, but they're believers, right? And there's always been a substantial threat of that. And in fact, they were the first archaeologists in the Middle East, right?
Oh, really?
That they went over there as faithful people, digging to prove their book. Since then, so I joined them on a dig. It's not particularly...
Write that down, biblical archaeologist. That'll be our title.
It's a tough mix, man. It's a tough mix of cultures, and they carry a big load because they have to both stay true to science while at the same time true to their faith. And I think you can balance those things, or at least you can tell if they're squirreling it. And it doesn't do them any good to go and change data and whatnot, which we were accused of, in support of the Bible. Your interpretation may be different. But so I got a call from this fellow, so I'm in touch with Biblical Archaeology Group. And they are fine archaeologists and have been digging Tal el-Hammam for, I think at that time, 15 seasons. So you go out once a year and they would take 50 or 60 people over a month and a half, generally in February, to the Middle East, and you dig your ass off and work like a damn mule to dig and excavate at Tal el-Hammam. So they've been doing that for years, and he said, and they have found a burn layer a couple of meters down. So a burn layer, again, it's kind of like that black mat, that they found a layer of destruction that indicates that the city there at Tal el-Hammam was absolutely pounded. Everything broken. Pieces of pottery on one side, some of them are melted at extremely high temperatures, right? But they didn't know all that. They didn't know the forensic part of it because they were Levantine archaeologists. You know, they didn't do the geochemistry and the microscope work. They don't. So I went over there. In the first year, I was about 50% digging with the rest of the gang, but then I had some real leash, and I was allowed to just walk around Tal el-Hammam and collect samples and see what I could see, blah, blah, blah. So we shipped all this stuff back to the U.S. Then the next year, I was joined, for people who are skeptical of a civilian like me doing this stuff, believe me, they'll put the scientists on you. But I did the initial work. And then the next year, I came back with an archaeologist, PhD, a rocket scientist, and an MD. And as part of the Comet Research Group, and we got more samples. Then they spent 6 years writing the scientific paper, and it came out in 2021, and it was a pretty big deal. It was published in Nature, and it provided evidence in support of the Genesis passages concerning Sodom and Gomorrah. And I have no doubt that, personally, that site is Sodom. And that's separate from just the impact evidence. There's a lot of other biblical evidence that suggests that the lost city of Sodom has now been found by Dr. Stephen Collins in Trinity Southwest University. And that's a Christian school in Albuquerque. So I dug with them, and we published that paper, and it has become arguably the most downloaded, popular, read scientific publication in Nature. Last time I checked, it had over 500,000 downloads and views. And I think what that is the generally sometimes woke, but atheist scientific types that are pissed off that something made it into Nature that suggests that there's biblical truth. So they're furtively going on there and reading that paper going, you know, the bastards, they never should have let that one through. And then there are the people of faith who say, oh my gosh, there's something in nature that provides proof to, our stories. And they go read it. And then there are other just science nuts. So you take those groups together, and it's a very popular paper. And they had to have it.
Is this the paper that got 800,000 downloads?
Yeah.
A Tunguska-sized airburst destroyed Tel al-Hammam, a Middle Bronze Age city in the Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea.
Yeah.
And when did this airburst? When did this happen?
3,700 years ago.
Wow.
So 1,700 BC. And that was during the time, if there was an Old Testament, that is the time period which is being testified to.
Okay.
And the interesting thing about the site that I thought was fascinating, I'd read the book. Dr. Collins wrote a fantastic book people can get on the whole story. It's a little dated now because they've discovered a lot else, and this paper came out. But it was like mentioned in the side on the book, and people talked on the side of the thing. They said, well, it's well established that Tel al-Hammam was the last campsite of the Israelites. So that area around that mound is called Abel Shittim, the field of acacias, which is kind of interesting right there. Acacias have DMT and all that, right? It's called the field of acacias. And it's always been accepted as if there was an exodus, that was the last campsite. And that area is kind of promoted as such. And when you dig at it, you look over your shoulder. Well, you look straight ahead to the Jordan River, which is about 6-7 miles away. And then another 6 or 7 miles away is Jericho, the oldest city in the world. And that's where the Israelites, that's when they went into Israel, and they sent the spies to Jericho, and it's all spelled out in the Bible. But the place that they did that from was clearly Tel al-Hammam, because when you look over behind yourself digging at that site, you're sitting at the foot of Mount Nebo, and there's the monastery up there that is the site where Moses looked out on the promised land. So he finished his 40-year journey. He never entered Israel, but at the foot of the mountain is where they would have entered the promised land, and where they would have established the tabernacle, I believe, and all of this stuff. So the ark sat on Tel al-Hammam, which is a hell of a second act. That was 700 years after the destruction, if it all be true.
Right.
I'm like, that's just a hell of a place to both be Sodom and the last place the ark sat until they moved to Jerusalem.
Who was the guy who led some big research project, the guy who claimed he discovered the ark, and he was like digging up all this ancient wood? Are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
I forget his name, but when I was studying this stuff closely, Ron Wyatt, maybe?
Ron, yes, that's it, Ron Wyatt.
See,
is this where he found it?
No.
Okay.
And thank goodness.
Right.
This has all been done in a academic context. This is serious archaeology out there. Now, there are people of faith, but I've seen the way they operate. They're not sitting there deliberately trying to skew things to prove their book. Yeah, that's from the top of Tel al-Hammam. Cool. And where people like Wyatt and stuff were, popular communicators to Christian audiences and trying to get their eyeballs. And maybe he's right about some stuff, maybe he's not right about some stuff, but he's no archaeologist. And actually, the place where if you ask people of faith, and I've actually become a better Christian since this, and I go to a Bible study these days. And if somebody told me that 10 years ago, I never believed it. But the other day, we were moving through Sodom right now and moving through Genesis. And it had in the footnotes of the Bible, when the guys read, they said, well, Sodom is supposed to be, according to our people, Christian historians and whatnot, south of the Dead Sea. So all the faithful argue against this, because not all of them, but that Dr. Collins and that team, they get pushback first from the other Christians. Even though it's the best example of science in support of the book that's ever been, that Christians that are into this stuff were raised to believe that it was south of the Dead Sea. because an old starch-collared biblical archaeologist of the 20s now, I think it's F.W. Albright or something from Kansas, who had gone over there to tell everybody that the Bible was true, he pegged it, for whatever series of reasons, as being south of the Dead Sea. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's important. And this is what Dr. Collins has explained very, very well, and I can't even imitate it. But what he gives textual evidence from the Bible that says that where Lot went and moved his sheep and all this kind of stuff is well watered as in Egypt. Well, first of all, south of the Dead Sea is the most forbidding dry desert on planet Earth. It's the Sinai and the Negev. I mean, nobody moves their sheep down there. But if you're north of the Dead Sea, where this is, yeah, today.
Would it have been the same back then?
Well, just like Egypt was green 5,000 years ago, but probably not 3,000 years ago, right? And it doesn't meet other geographical clues that they give in the Bible. If you follow all the stuff and reverse engineer it as Collins did and think of it without the presumptions of Albright and the Christians and without the presumptions of the mainstream that it's all bullshit, Collins looked at it with a new face and he said, geographically, based on what they're saying here in the Bible, I think well watered as in Egypt, it's referring to the Nile Delta. So you have the river comes up and then it goes into a delta into the Mediterranean. The same thing happens with the River Jordan as it goes in the Dead Sea. It has a delta, or used to, now it's destroyed. But that was the well watered as in Egypt. It's just like, except it's upside down. It's just like Egypt there. It's like a miniature Egypt. And it's lush and green, and they still grow tomatoes and bananas and weed. Hell, I was up on the top of the thing and saw these like 3 or 4 fires at the farms down below. And I was like, what are they doing out there?
Growing pot?
And they said, oh, the police came in. Those are raids. And they said that's where most of your Middle Eastern weed is grown, in that view, where you can see Jerusalem, Jericho, and whatnot. But that's the weed area, right? And I said, no shit. But
you're saying this was about 3,000 years, about 1,000 BC?
Yeah, 1700. Yep.
Okay. So are there any, do you think that was the only impact during that time? Or do you think there's other evidence of other impacts around the world during that same time? Like, assuming that we passed through
that same time,
or meteor stream when that happened, and maybe there's some other archaeological sites that we can look at that date to 3,000 years ago?
Absolutely. And there's only one team in the world doing it, which is ours. I mean, nobody, if you went and looked and used a slight fraction of the forensic and archaeological and investigative expertise that is available to modern science and looked for these things and took it seriously, hell, you could knock it out in a year. They need to go all around the world. You could, for $10 million National Science Foundation grant, you could go rule this thing in or out by going to shallow grading soils around the world and testing their geochemistry. A key thing about, I didn't talk about the geochemistry.
But like, for example, when you go to some of the spots that you were showing earlier with the black mat in the United States, there's a trash can right here you can throw in.
Thank you.
There's no black mat around the 3,000 year ago depth, right? So that was probably only focused in that part of the world.
That's right, Danny. That's right. We don't think that this was a worldwide swarm. So just like Tunguska,
similar to
you might have gotten
exactly right. Okay,
but there are other indications that we had other bad days.